Captain Jake Mitchell stood at attention as the holographic display flickered to life, casting blue shadows across the assembled soldiers in the Coalition briefing room. The mixed species unit before him represented the finest the galaxy had to offer: sleek Valan warriors with their crystalline armor, hulking Korath berserkers whose tusks gleamed in the artificial light, and the spider-like Nexari technicians whose multiple eyes tracked every movement with mechanical precision. Intelligence reports indicate the Vex Empire has established a forward base on Kepler 7, announced Commander Thane, a tall Valan whose voice carried the musical quality of his species. Their energy shields are impenetrable to conventional assault. We need creative solutions. Jake studied the tactical display, his human eyes picking up details that the other's enhanced vision might miss. It wasn't about seeing better, it was about seeing differently. The Vex had positioned their base in a crater, surrounded by natural barriers that would funnel any attack into a killing field. Standard military doctrine would call for orbital bombardment, but the civilian population below made that impossible. Captain Mitchell, Thane continued, your unit will lead the ground assault. Any questions? Before Jake could respond, Sergeant Vex, a Korath whose scarred hide told stories of 100 battles, let out a rumbling laugh. Commander, perhaps we should consult the humans' ancient war gods first. Maybe Thor will throw his hammer, or Ares. We'll charge ahead with bronze spears. The assembled aliens joined in the laughter, their various sounds creating a cacophony of amusement. Lieutenant Kira, a Nexari whose technical expertise was unmatched, added with clicking mandibles, yes, surely the primitive human myths will guide us to victory. Perhaps we should sacrifice a goat to ensure good fortune. Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks but maintained his composure. These beings, for all their advanced technology and enhanced capabilities, saw human culture as nothing more than quaint fairy tales. They had faster reflexes, stronger bodies, and minds that could process information at rates that would overwhelm a human nervous system. What they lacked, though they didn't know it yet, was something far more valuable. No question, sir, Jake replied evenly. My unit will be ready. As the briefing concluded and the aliens filed out, still chuckling about human mythology, Jake remained behind. He stared at the tactical display, but his mind wandered to the stories his grandfather had told him, tales of soldiers who fought impossible odds, of leaders who inspired through sacrifice, of victories snatched from the jaws of defeat through sheer determination. The galaxy saw these stories as primitive superstitions, relics of a species that had barely crawled out of its gravity well before joining the greater cosmic community. They measured worth in technological advancement, in the speed of neural processing, in the efficiency of killing machines. But Jake knew something they DN single quotes D. Every great journey starts with a few brave explorers. Sci-Fi's stellar conflict is just beginning, and your support means everything. If you're hungry for HFY battles and tales of human valor against alien might, hit subscribe, it's free, and it helps us bring these frontlines to you. The human myths weren't just stories. They were instruction manuals, Jake's fingers traced the edge of his combat knife, a primitive weapon by galactic standards, but one that had never failed him. The blade had been forged by his great-grandfather, a veteran of Earth's final world war, using techniques that predated faster-than-light travel by centuries. The aliens would see it as a curiosity, a useless relic in an age of plasma weapons and energy shields. They would learn differently. Tomorrow, they would face the Vex Empire's finest warriors, creatures bred for combat in ways that made even the Coalition's enhanced soldiers look weak. The coming battle would test every assumption the galaxy had made about humanity's place in the cosmic order. Jake smiled grimly as he left the briefing room. The aliens thought they understood war because they had mastered the technology of killing. But humanity had learned something far more valuable in their bloody climb from the caves. To the stars, they had learned how to die for something greater than themselves. And sometimes, that made all the difference. The transport ship Stellar Hammer shuddered as it broke through Kepler 7's atmosphere, its hull groaning under the stress of atmospheric entry. Jake gripped his restraints as the ship bucked and rolled, watching his alien comrades prepare for battle with methodical precision. Sergeant Vex checked his plasma cannon's power cells for the third time, his massive hands moving with surprising delicacy. The Korath's enhanced reflexes and military conditioning made him the perfect soldier by galactic standards, fast, strong, and programmed to follow orders without question. Lieutenant Kira's multiple limbs worked simultaneously, calibrating, targeting systems and running diagnostics on the squad's equipment. Her cybernetic implants processed battlefield data at rates that would liquefy a human brain. 60 seconds to drop zone, announced the pilot. Her voice filtered through the ship's communication system. Jake felt the familiar weight of his grandfather's knife at his side, a comforting presence among the advanced weaponry surrounding him. His standard-issue plasma rifle felt foreign in his hands, too clean and precise. Human weapons had weight, had personality. They demanded respect and gave it in return. The ship's cargo bay doors opened with a pneumatic hiss, revealing the hostile landscape below. Kepler-7's surface was a maze of crystalline formations and methane geysers, painted in shades of amber and gold under the alien sun. In the distance, the Vex fortress rose like a black wound against the horizon, its energy shields creating a shimmering dome of death. "Remember," Vex shouted over the wind, "we maintain formation, advance by the book, and trust in our superior technology. The Vex may be fierce, but they lack our tactical sophistication." Jake nodded but said nothing. The Vex Empire had conquered 17 star systems, using the same primitive tactics that had allowed humans to dominate Earth for millennia. While the galaxy had evolved beyond such crude methods, the Vex had perfected them. The first indication of trouble came when their preliminary scouts failed to report back. Kira's sensors showed no enemy movement, no heat signatures, no electromagnetic disturbances. According to her instruments, the path to the fortress was clear. "Something's wrong," Jake muttered, but his words were lost in the wind. They advanced in perfect formation, each soldier maintaining precise spacing and covering predetermined fields of fire. It was textbook coalition tactics, refined through countless simulations and theoretical battle scenarios. It was also exactly what the Vex had been expecting. The attack came from below. Vex warriors erupted from concealed positions in the crystalline formations, their chitinous armor gleaming with an oily sheen. They moved with fluid grace, their multiple limbs wielding weapons that seemed to grow from their bodies rather than being held. These weren't the mindless beasts the Coalition intelligence had described. They were cunning, patient, and utterly ruthless. Sergeant Vex's plasma cannon roared to life, sending bolts of superheated energy into the enemy ranks. His enhanced reflexes served him well, each shot finding its mark with mechanical precision. But for every Vex warrior that fell, two more seemed to take its place. Kira's targeting system struggled to track the enemy's erratic movement patterns. The Vex didn't advance in straight lines or maintain formation. They flowed like water, adapting to the battlefield with an organic intelligence that defied algorithmic prediction. "They're not following standard tactical doctrine," she reported, her voice tight with confusion. Jake watched his alien comrades struggle against an enemy that refused to fight fair. The Coalition soldiers had been trained to face opponents who would respond logically to superior firepower and tactical positioning. The Vex, however, seemed to operate on entirely different principles. "Fall back to secondary positions," Vex ordered, his voice carrying the authority of his rank, but the Vex had anticipated this move as well. As the Coalition forces retreated, they found their escape routes blocked by more enemy warriors. The textbook response to encirclement was to form a defensive perimeter and call for orbital support. But the civilian population below made that impossible. Jake felt something stirring in his chest, a familiar sensation from his youth when he had read about ancient human warriors facing impossible odds. The aliens saw mythology as primitive superstition, but those stories had been forged in the crucible of survival. They weren't fantasy, they were instructions. "New plan," Jake announced, his voice cutting through the chaos of battle. He began moving in ways that violated every principle of modern warfare, abandoning cover to draw enemy fire, using misdirection instead of superior positioning. The aliens watched in horror as their human captain seemed to court death with every step, but something remarkable happened. The Vex, conditioned to expect rational tactical responses, began to hesitate. Jake's seemingly suicidal maneuvers confused their organic intelligence, creating gaps in their formation that hadn't existed moments before. What are you doing? Kira demanded, her sensors unable to predict Jake's next move. Something my grandfather taught me, Jake replied, sliding his knife from its sheath. Sometimes you have to think like your ancestors. The blade felt warm in his hand, as if it remembered the blood of countless battles. The siege of Firebase Delta stretched into its third day, and the alien soldiers of Jake's unit were beginning to show signs of strain that their superior physiology should have prevented. The Vex had surrounded their position with methodical precision, cutting off supply lines and communication relays with tactics that seemed to emerge from nowhere. Sergeant Vex's plasma cannon had fallen silent, its power cells depleted. The massive Korath warrior sat with his back against the bunker wall, his enhanced muscles twitching with exhaustion. His species could fight for days without rest, but the psychological pressure of constant, unpredictable attacks was wearing down even his conditioned mind. "They're not following any tactical manual I know," Lieutenant Kira reported, her multiple eyes dim with fatigue. Her cybernetic implants had been overloaded by the Vex's chaotic battle patterns, forcing her to rely on organic senses that felt inadequate after a lifetime of technological enhancement. Jake moved through the firebase like a ghost, checking defensive positions and monitoring enemy movements with an intensity that puzzled his alien comrades. While they relied on sensors and enhanced vision, he seemed to read the battlefield through some primitive intuition that defied logical explanation. "Captain," Vex called out, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "Our ammunition is running low, and the enemy shows no signs of weakening. Perhaps we should consider surrender." The suggestion sent a chill through the firebase. Surrender was a tactical option, a mathematical decision based on resource allocation and probability analysis. For beings who viewed warfare as a problem to be solved through superior technology, admitting defeat was simply accepting an unfavorable equation. Jake paused in his patrol, his hand instinctively moving to his grandfather's knife. The blade caught the light from the firebase's emergency illumination, its worn surface reflecting decades of use. To his alien comrades, it was a useless relic. To Jake, it was a connection to something they couldn't understand. "No surrender," he said quietly. "Not today." As if summoned by his words, the Vex launched another assault. This time, they came from multiple directions simultaneously, their chitinous forms moving with liquid grace across the hostile terrain. Traditional defensive doctrine called for concentrating fire on the primary threat, but Jake had already identified the weakness in that approach. Instead of following standard protocols, he began issuing orders that violated every principle of modern warfare. He divided his forces, sent soldiers to positions that offered no tactical advantage, and directed fire at targets that posed no immediate threat. "Captain, your orders don't make sense," Kira protested, her analytical mind struggling to process the logic behind his commands. "They're not supposed to make sense," Jake replied, watching the Vex formation begin to waver. "That's the point." The enemy had adapted to fight against rational opponents who would respond predictably to superior force. They had studied coalition tactics, learned to counter advanced weaponry, and developed strategies to exploit the logical thinking patterns of enhanced alien minds. But Jake wasn't fighting like a modern soldier. He was fighting like a human. The tactics he employed came from stories older than spaceflight, from battles fought with steel and courage, when humanity's greatest weapons were their determination and their willingness to sacrifice everything for victory. He moved his forces like pieces on a chessboard, but it was a game the Vex had never learned to play. Sergeant Vex found himself in a position that should have been indefensible, but the Vex warriors approaching his location seemed confused by his presence there. Their organic intelligence couldn't process why an enemy would voluntarily occupy disadvantageous ground. "I don't understand," Vex transmitted over the comm. "They should have overrun my position by now." "Keep fighting," Jake replied. "Trust the process." Lieutenant Kira discovered that her seemingly random firing patterns were creating gaps in the enemy formation that hadn't existed moments before. The Vex were adapting to her expected behavior, not her actual movements. "It's like they're fighting ghosts," she reported, wonder creeping into her voice. Jake smiled grimly as he watched his plan unfold. The aliens had mocked human mythology, dismissing it as primitive superstition. But those stories contained wisdom earned through countless generations of survival. They taught lessons about courage, sacrifice, and the power of fighting for something greater than oneself. As the battle raged around him, Jake felt the weight of his ancestors' legacy. Every human who had ever stood against impossible odds was there with him, their spirits flowing through the worn handle of his grandfather's knife. The Vex were discovering that some enemies couldn't be defeated through superior technology or tactical analysis. Some battles could only be won through the indomitable human spirit, forged in the crucible of 1,000 ancient wars. And sometimes that was enough. The final assault came at dawn, when Kepler-7's alien sun cast long shadows across the battlefield. The Vex had gathered their remaining forces into a massive wave of chitinous death, their organic intelligence finally abandoning subtlety for overwhelming force. From the firebase's battered walls, Jake could see thousands of enemy warriors moving across the crystalline landscape like a living tide. "They're done playing games," Sergeant Vex observed, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and dread. The massive Korath had seen countless battles, but nothing had prepared him for the primal terror of facing an enemy that refused to die according to mathematical projections. Lieutenant Kira's sensors painted a grim picture. Energy signatures indicate at least 3,000 individual combatants. "Our remaining ammunition won't last more than 10 minutes against that force." Jake stood atop the firebase's main bunker, his grandfather's knife gleaming in the dawn light. Around him, his alien comrades prepared for what they believed would be their final battle. Their enhanced physiology and advanced training had carried them this far, but even they had limits. "Captain," Vex said quietly, "it has been an honor serving under your command. Your unconventional methods have taught us much about the nature of warfare." "The honor has been mine," Jake replied, but his voice carried a strange confidence that puzzled his subordinates. "However, this battle isn't over." As the Vex horde approached, Jake began to speak. His words weren't tactical instructions or strategic analysis. They were something far older and more powerful. He spoke of ancient human warriors who had faced impossible odds, of soldiers who had chosen death over defeat, of heroes who had become legends through their willingness to sacrifice everything for their comrades. The alien soldiers listened with growing fascination. They had dismissed these stories as primitive mythology, but Jake's words carried the weight of lived experience. He spoke of Marathon, where a single messenger had run himself to death to bring word of victory. He told of Thermopylae, where 300 warriors had held an entire army at bay through sheer determination. He recounted the siege of Stalingrad, where humans had fought for every inch of ground against an enemy that seemed invincible. "These aren't just stories," Jake continued, his voice rising above the sound of approaching death. "They're instructions. They're the DNA of human warfare, passed down through generations of warriors who understood that victory isn't about having the best weapons or the fastest reflexes. It's about refusing to surrender when surrender is the only logical choice." "Sergeant." Vex felt something stirring in his chest that his enhanced physiology couldn't explain. The approaching Vex army should have triggered his programmed fear responses, but instead, he felt in strange eagerness for battle. Lieutenant Kira's analytical mind struggled to process the emotions flooding her system. Her cybernetic implants had been designed to suppress such inefficiencies, but Jake's words were reaching something deeper than technology could touch. "Today," Jake announced, raising his grandfather's knife toward the approaching enemy, "we fight not as coalition soldiers following tactical doctrine, but as warriors defending something precious. We fight for the idea that courage matters more than technology, that sacrifice has meaning, and that some things are worth dying for." The Vex wave struck the firebase with overwhelming force, their chitinous forms crashing against the defensive perimeter like a tide of living death. But something had changed in the defenders. The alien soldiers who had once fought with mechanical precision now moved with fluid grace, their enhanced abilities enhanced further by something that couldn't be measured or quantified. Vex found himself charging into enemy ranks with his empty plasma cannon, using the weapon as a club with devastating effect. His tactical training screamed that this was suicide, but his spirit soared with each blow. For the first time in his life, he was fighting for something more than mission parameters. Kira abandoned her sensor readings and targeting systems, relying instead on intuition and instinct. Her multiple limbs moved with deadly precision, but now they were guided by something beyond algorithmic calculation. She was fighting with the fury of a warrior, not the efficiency of a machine. Jake moved through the battle like a force of nature, his ancient knife cutting through enemy armor with impossible effectiveness. The Vex warriors seemed to hesitate when they faced him, their organic intelligence recognizing something in his bearing that defied their understanding of human capability. The battle raged for hours, impossible odds defied by warriors who had transcended their limitations. When the last Vex warrior fell, the firebase was silent except for the heavy breathing of survivors who had achieved something greater than victory. They had become legends. The aftermath of the battle at Firebase Delta sent shockwaves through the Coalition command structure. Military analysts pored over the tactical recordings, trying to understand how a single human officer and his mixed species unit had defeated a force that should have overwhelmed them through sheer numbers. Jake sat in the debriefing room, his grandfather's knife cleaned and returned to its sheath. Across from him, Coalition Command's finest strategic minds struggled to reconcile the battle footage with established military doctrine. The tactics his unit had employed violated every principle of modern warfare, yet they had achieved complete victory against impossible odds. "Captain Mitchell," Commander Thane began, his musical Valen voice carrying notes of confusion. "Your unit's performance was extraordinary, however. We're having difficulty understanding the strategic principles behind your tactical decisions." Jake glanced at Sergeant Vex, who sat with uncharacteristic stillness. The massive Korath warrior had been changed by the battle, his enhanced physiology somehow elevated by something that couldn't be measured in laboratories or training simulators. Where once he had been a perfect soldier, now he was something more, a warrior who understood that victory required more than superior firepower. Lieutenant Kira's multiple eyes tracked the conversation with new intensity. Her cybernetic implants had been recalibrated since the battle, but she found herself relying less on their analytical output and more on instincts she hadn't known she possessed. The human concept of intuition had become more than a curious biological inefficiency. It was a tactical advantage that no algorithm could replicate. "With respect, Commander," Jake replied, "the principles aren't new. They're older than spaceflight, older than the Coalition itself. My species has been refining them for millennia." "You're referring to the mythological references in your pre-battle address," Thane said, consulting his notes. "Our xenanthropologists have studied these stories. They appear to be fictional narratives designed to instill cultural values rather than practical military doctrine." Vex leaned forward, his scarred features animated with unexpected passion. "Permission to speak, sir?" Thane nodded, clearly curious about the Korath's perspective. "The stories aren't fiction," Vex said, his voice carrying conviction that surprised even him. "They're operational manuals. Every human myth contains tactical wisdom that we've forgotten in our pursuit of technological superiority. Captain Mitchell didn't just defeat the Vex, he taught us how to fight with our spirits instead of just our bodies." Kira's mandibles clicked in agreement. The human approach to warfare transcends mere tactical doctrine. It incorporates psychological elements that our sensors can't measure but our enemies can feel. The Vex weren't just outfought, they were outmaneuvered on a level that their organic intelligence couldn't process. Jake felt a surge of pride in his alien comrades. They had experienced something that the galaxy's greatest military minds couldn't understand from tactical recordings and statistical analysis. They had learned what it meant to fight as humans fought, not just with weapons and technology, but with the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who had faced extinction and chosen defiance. "The myths your people dismiss as primitive, superstition," Jake continued, "are actually the distilled essence of human military experience. Every story of heroes facing impossible odds contains lessons about courage, sacrifice, and the power of fighting for something greater than oneself. They're not just tales, they're the DNA of human warfare." Commander Thane's crystalline features reflected the light in patterns that suggested deep thought. "Are you suggesting that human cultural narratives represent a strategic advantage that we've overlooked?" "I'm suggesting that you've been measuring the wrong things," Jake replied. Technology can be copied, enhanced physiology can be replicated, but the human spirit, the willingness to die for an ideal, that's something that can't be manufactured or programmed. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. For centuries, the galaxy had viewed humanity as the Coalition's junior partner, valuable for their adaptability, but inferior in every measurable category. The idea that their primitive mythology might contain strategic wisdom that advanced civilizations had lost was revolutionary. Sergeant Vex stood and saluted, his massive frame somehow conveying both respect and revelation. Captain Mitchell, it has been an honor learning what it truly means to be a warrior. Your species may be young by galactic standards, but you've mastered something that the rest of us forgot in our rush toward technological perfection. Lieutenant Kira's multiple eyes focused on Jake with new understanding. The human myths aren't about the past, they're about the future. They're instructions for becoming more than what we were designed to be. Jake nodded, feeling the weight of his ancestors' legacy. The galaxy had mocked human mythology, dismissing it as the fantasies of a primitive species. But those stories contained something precious, the knowledge that victory belonged not to the strongest or the fastest, but to those who refused to surrender when surrender was the only logical choice. As the debriefing concluded and the alien officers filed out, Jake remained behind. He drew his grandfather's knife and studied its worn surface, seeing not just a weapon, but a connection to every human who had ever stood against impossible odds. The galaxy was about to discover that humanity's greatest contribution wasn't their adaptability or their technology, it was their indomitable spirit, forged in the crucible of countless ancient wars and preserved in the myths they had carried. To the stars. The age of human mythology was about to become the age of human legend.